Hello, and welcome to Shy Talk, an Irish history podcast. My name's Kevin Larney, and this week we were joined by a very special guest, Fintan O'Toole of the Irish Times, who was on with us to talk about his book, We Don't Know Ourselves, which is a very interesting book. It's a look at Irish history over the span of Fintan's life and kind of what he thinks are some of the key moments over the past 60 odd years that have kind of shaped us as a country. But we had a very interesting chat with him. Fintan is currently over in America doing some lecture tours there, so we had to record it via Zoom, so there's a little bit of echo, but Jason did a great job cleaning it up, so you barely even notice, other than I just told you there. But before we get into the episode, we wanted to give a shout out to one of the other great podcasts that's on the Spreaker network, the Working Class History Podcast. Myself and Jason have been listening to it over the last couple of weeks, and it's really interesting. It kind of takes a look at big historical events, but ones that are particularly driven by working class, ordinary people. It's very well researched. They've got very interesting guests on to talk about their experiences. We figured if you're listening to this podcast, you'd definitely be interested in their podcast. A couple of episodes in particular with like an Irish connection. You could check out episodes 65 and 66 about the 1972 UK workers' strike, the building workers' strike over in the UK. There's obviously a lot of Irish workers involved in that. And there's episodes 57 and 58 about the Virginia Mine Wars, which touch on Mother Jones, which is a figure we'll definitely have to do for the podcast at some point in the future. They've also got episodes about the Stonewall riots, which is a really, really interesting area of American and LGBT history in general. And they've got some Irish American speakers in that episode. There's also episodes on the Hong Kong riots against British rule, which, to be honest, if you're listening to this podcast, you'd probably enjoy that. So definitely check them out, Working Class History. There'll be a link to their show in the description of this episode, as well as a link to Fintan O'Toole's socials where you can follow him, and our own, where you can follow us and look at the videos that we've got. We've finally done it. We've got cameras. We're doing video content. We'll be putting out the first bits over the next couple of weeks. So follow us there. And also buy tickets to the live show in the Wild Duck, which is coming up next month. And then you won't even need a video. You can just see us in real life. But that's it. That's all the plugs. Listen to Working Class History. Go follow Fintan O'Toole and buy his book, We Don't Know Ourselves. Buy tickets to the Wild Ducks. Just start throwing money at the whole thing. But anyway, listen, enjoy this episode and we'll chat to you soon.
Gather around now, you're in for a story. Old tales of lore, all in search of a glory. The history and mystery of lads, lasses and all. Discoveries and voyages, the rise and the fall. Follow me now as we go back in time. We trace the steps of Irish heritage to find. Joseph from Carlo and Kevin the Dog. Guide you through the ways of Shy.
We've actually, when we were reading through it again recently, we've realized like we did a lot of the same sort of topics. So the book, for anyone who's unaware, is sort of Ireland's history from your birth up until 2010, and just sort of a bit of colour from yourself, I suppose, and just tying different events and how you feel like it shaped the country. And some of the ones I guess we touched on ourselves were the Malcolm MacArthur, the Gubu murders. I wanted to read a quote from your book about that, where you were I think was you walking into a shop on the day after the murders, and there was a APB ad for a certain type of man who looked like yourself, but you were quoted, I asked her for some eggs and the Irish Times, and she handed them over. She looked at me oddly again, as if she was scrutinising my face for some surreptitious mark of guilt. And I just wanted to ask you, did you really buy the Irish Times, or was that just a retroactive plug?
Oh no, I did.
I thought you might have snuck that in.
This goes back to the days. Well, actually, I still do it. I'm one of those people who still likes a physical newspaper. But of course, I mean, almost everybody bought a paper in those days. In
Sure.
the 1980s. It might not have been the Irish Times, but and a lot of people bought two papers a day. Like my parents, who were kind of working class, ordinary people in Crumlin, but they would have bought a morning paper, and then an evening paper, So
Sure.
I did buy the Irish Times, absolutely, yeah.
But it was a fascinating story. It was one of the earlier ones we did, the Cooper murders, and how, I guess, one instance sort of gripped the whole country, which is what then another chapter, which is very relevant in the last couple of days, the combination of the Kerry babies murder and the moving statues, which I'm not sure has anyone asked you recently, I suppose, about this, but I assume you've been following the updates in that in the last 48 hours here.
Yeah,
Um,
very much so. Yeah, it's
yeah,
one of those weird stories, isn't it? That seems impossible to ever end. It just kind of keeps multiplying itself and going on and on and on. And coming back. Uh, and I do think, I mean, so yeah, when I was thinking about it, how to tell the story in the book, I mean, I thought to come at it through the moving statues because. Uh, I went to a place called Asti, which is a little village in North Kerry, not too
yeah,
far away from Abbeydorney, which is where the Hayes family lived. And that's where the statues started moving. At the back of the church, there was a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and little kids started seeing it moving. And then this became like for months, this was a huge national event where people were going down in the hope, that they would see the statue move. And yeah, it was very, very weird, and it was part of
mm,
this huge outbreak of moving statues that took on. But if you talk to people about it, people who were like, why were they going to see the statues moving? There was a real sense of disturbance. I mean, this stuff is kind of funny and it has those comic elements to it, but there was a kind of national nervous breakdown going on at that time. And the obsession with abortion, for example, that
yeah,
had the 1983 constitutional referendum. You had the hunger strikes in the north, which were an incredible psychodrama. Like they were really playing people's heads. There was economic collapse. There was mass unemployment. And the Kerry babies thing. It was a witch trial. I mean, you look back at it now and you say, what was this thing? It was a witch trial.
yeah,
And you look historically, at times of great social tension or whatever, witches get blamed, and the unfortunate Hayes family, and particularly Joanne Hayes, was the witch. But there
yeah,
was that sense, that these things were related in people's heads, that we were the Kerry babies thing in the heads of these people showed how terrible Ireland had become and how it had lost the faith. And Joanne Hayes has been held up as the exemplar of this sort of amoral Ireland and the breakdown of all the rules. And then the Blessed Virgin Mary was going to come and save us. These
yeah,
appearances were a sort of hankering after salvation, and it was a very strange time to be a journalist because journalists report on facts, but these facts were not just to do with physical things; they were also to do with this kind of strange mental state that the place was in.
yeah. So what this seemed like a literal, so was sign from God to make up for all of the hardship that was happening in the country at the time.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's kind of easy to look back on it and say, it is funny, and of course, a lot of people thought it was very funny at the time.
Sure.
Well, that was my quick question. In terms of like at the time, how constant was the conversation around that? It's not looking back. Obviously not with rose tinted glasses, but looking back now from a distance, like was it part of the cultural zeitgeist? Was that like what people were waking up every day talking about?
I wouldn't say necessarily everybody was waking up every day and talking about it, but it was absolutely like for that whole, particularly all that summer. It was a constant topic of conversation and news reports, and you would meet people. I mean, you'd meet people say, "Oh, I'm going down to Ballinspittle," which was one of the biggest ones,
Yeah,
or Asti or whatever, and it really was something that was on an awful lot of people's minds, even while there were a lot of people who were breaking their sides laughing at the thing, felt it was kind of ridiculous and shameful and put the country in a bad light. And then of course you got a lot of international media attention on it and all that sort of stuff. But
sure.
there were a lot of people actually who were just desperate, give us a sign, give us a
Yeah,
sign
yeah,
that that actually Ireland can go back to being this kind of beacon of Catholic holiness that it's losing, and I suppose what it's a sign of, like, is just how deep that culture had gone, just for how many people this was their identity. And it's gone so long now that it just seems like, it was all kind of crazy, but it was very deeply how an awful lot of Irish people felt about themselves.
The chapter we talk about Riverdance and the Irish Cultural Association with the dancing moving away due to the church and the laws that they would have put in the 30s, but people wanted to, like, this idea that some people wanted to go back to that, but seemingly then by the 30s and 40s, people had already, like, that was when the it's not immigration, but immigration from belief in religion would have begun there. So that by this time, you were talking, what, about 50 years later? So that there is still, like, what percentage of the population was like that? Because it feels like the Ireland that we live in now, or the people of our generation we talk to, it is kind of, faith has been lost almost entirely. So even trying to find the ratio or percentage breakdown between that time then and now.
It's a great question, actually. And I mean, I think the best metric for this, right? So, rather than just giving you my opinion on it, I think the best way to measure it really are those two referendums in the mid 1980s, which is the one on abortion and one on divorce. And they were culture war stuff. We didn't use that term at the time, but really they were about, they weren't really about abortion and divorce. They were about, how do we identify ourselves? What do we think Ireland is? And they both had almost exactly the same outcome. So, in 83, 2-1 vote to put the ban on abortion into the Constitution, even though, of course, it was already banned. Remember, it wasn't like it was legal, and we were kind of getting rid of it.
Just kind of making sure this is going to be the case for the next good while.
But it was a kind of a statement, wasn't it? It was sort of saying, for forever and ever, Ireland's going to be the most Catholic country in the world. That's what this is about. And then 2 years later, you have, I mean, in a way, even more extraordinary. I mean, it wasn't as dramatic, but I mean, 66% of people voted to leave in the Constitution the ban on divorce. Right, divorce. that it wasn't just a matter of law; it was a matter of the Constitution. And again, it was this kind of statement about ourselves. So to answer your question, I would say it was roughly 2-1. That there was a younger, more liberal, more urban, perhaps more highly educated 1/3 of people who wanted profound change and didn't really identify with this hyper-Catholic Ireland. But there were 2/3 of people who either passionately identified with it or at least symbolically wanted it to stay in place. They thought, this is the thing that we hold on to. And maybe, it's not in spite of change, but maybe because of change, maybe because everything was actually changing and because things were going to hell, with mass emigration and mass unemployment. And, there's this impulse to just kind of hold on to what we think we know about ourselves.
Yeah.
And the thing that people thought they know about themselves was that, well, yeah, things may be absolutely awful, but at least we're very holy.
I suppose that all ties in together, I guess, in that traditionally the younger voter would skew more liberal, and they are, as you're saying, at that point in time, running for the hills, heading off to America, heading to England, and further. So, yeah, you'd imagine those are the main cohort who are going to be voting for things like abortion and divorce, and they're gone.
But
that's absolutely true. And you can never understate it in terms of
the
whole way that Ireland was set up. You had this kind of weird thing of in order to keep a very conservative society, you had to export most of your young people,
which we're very good at.
Which we've been very good at, and in a way we still do to some extent, but it's deeply embedded, isn't it? Like that, and this has been going on for hundreds of years. Like, so we're talking about history. This is deep history.
I suppose we romanticize the idea of the fighting Irish and revolution, but really a lot of it is the history from the flight of the Earls, the wild geese, post-famine emigration. A lot of the time we do choose the option to just go over to America and then sing sad songs about how we could have stayed and fought. But
I think that's very true. That we vote with our feet a lot of the time, and so instead of actually as you say, like taking on a system or confronting it, there's often this sense of despair about it, and you say, well, actually, you know what, I'd be better off somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, there's a history of like glorious short run revolutions that are very, romantic and poetic, that last, 2 or 3 days, and then you can spend 50 years raising money for and singing songs about it afterwards. But which, just to go out to the first story of the moving statues, we come across an interesting story a while ago about there's a similar thing in Temple Ogue in 1920, where the War of Independence came to a halt because a young man had said he'd seen blood coming out of the eyes of a Virgin Mary statue there. And it's a similar thing, I suppose, where the country there's this same sense of evil and war and blood, and it all comes to a standstill. And people then as well are flocking in their thousands or tens of thousands down to, see the statue. And again, probably just for a sense of hope or a sense of, some religious intervention into what's happening. But something that did similar happen, I think, like 2 years ago. Was there another video of some apparition at Knock? Or maybe that was 5 or 6 years ago this time. But I don't know. Maybe we're overdue one, I suppose, at this stage, 1920s to 1980s.
Yeah. I mean, you wonder, like, will the apparitions become different? Will it be something completely different from the Blessed Virgin? You kind of wonder. I mean, because it is very important. We don't get too snobbish about the past, and think, well, those people were all very stupid and we're very smart. God knows, you look at conspiracy theories, you look at, maybe a lot of that kind of thinking has gone online, into how can we explain the world? While it's all to do with pedophiles in a pizza parlor somewhere, or whatever, So it's not necessarily that we're any smarter than people were in the 1980s in Ireland. It's maybe just that that it takes different forms.
That's it. Yeah, we're certainly, I'd say, as gullible or susceptible to preying on those kind of fears. But just to go back to the Kerry babies, there is something. I mean, I don't know. There's something, obviously, that's a huge tragedy. But I was thinking of the last day or two, there is something kind of nice, is probably the wrong word, but like the fact that was almost 40 years ago, and that I was driving and I heard it on the radio, and you're like, oh, that's that one instance of a baby being killed. The fact that everyone remembers it, and it's a news story now. I feel like we're very hard on ourselves here, and we always seem to think that this is the worst place in the world to live. And despite the fact, as you said already, that we have a history of emigration, it often feels like a lot of Irish people have never seen other countries or how things go there. And I think, it's not like, I don't know, for a case like that to come up 40 years later, and for it to be national news and for people to be invested in it, kind of speaks to how these things do still affect us all. And we is quite a nice community on the island.
I would strongly agree with you, Kevin. I mean, I'm currently in the United States, like yesterday, like there's a massacre in a school.
Yeah.
Kids, like 9-year-old kids, I mean, Jesus Christ, that will be forgotten.
Yeah.
In a bloody week, it's front page news today. It's on the, the headlines and the cable channels, whatever. They'll move on to the next one, And, like I asked them, what was the last massacre? I can't remember,
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating to write about Ireland, actually, is exactly that stuff doesn't go away, and, it's, I think it's why it's so interesting for you guys to be talking about history, because history is not a dead thing here. It's, it's a living, it's a living thing that we're all involved in, and is kind of coming and going, and things that you think are over are not over. And yes, sometimes that's our disability, that we can't get over things, but there is something human about it too, which is that there is memory, and there is a connection.
We were listing off the things earlier on of, like, there's Sophie just gone to Plantier, obviously, but last year with Aisling Murphy, that will be remembered a lot, like, for years and years and years. But then I think you summed it up in with the chapter talking about the Troubles, opened up with who was going to turn on the Christmas lights, Bill Clinton or the Power Rangers. But I think you'd said at that stage, per 100,000 people, there was 6 people in Northern Ireland dying via murder, I guess, that year. But in Chicago, where Bill Clinton is from, that was 60. So it's 10 times the size.
Yeah, yeah. We're sort of lucky. It sounds like a horrible thing to say that Ireland's lucky. And you think about the Troubles, and you think, well, come on,
Yeah.
that's really bad taste. But and I don't mean we're lucky to have had all that horrific violence, and this legacy is still very much alive. But people cared about it, internationally, and compared to so many horrific conflicts going on around the world, but also as you say, even not things that aren't even recognized as conflicts. So drug wars going on in Chicago or in Miami, or where huge numbers of young people being killed on a regular basis. And they're just pretty much ignored. They just don't count. I mean, there's no. The United Nations isn't getting involved. The American Secretary of State isn't flying in to see and sort it out. The American President, the British Prime Minister,
Yeah.
So Ireland has a completely outsized presence in the consciousness of the world, and we do benefit from this. I mean, the fact that so many Clinton was a great example. Put so much effort into 25 years ago, trying to sort out the Northern Ireland conflict, and that it's still a big thing in America. Like, they still talk about it. It's still seen as a great achievement and all that kind of stuff. We're sort of fortunate that we can draw on these energies at certain times, because the worst thing is when nobody gives a damn.
I wonder how we got to, I don't know, I've always thought, especially for Americans, obviously they're the main source of, like, a lot of Americans love this idea of the mutt genealogy, as they'd say, and tracing back your ancestry. And you've got a choice. If you go back 3 generations, and you've got a choice between, like, Spanish, French, Irish, German, Latvian, Russian, whatever. I think a lot of people are drawn to what's the one where I don't need to learn a new language. I just speak English. The main cultural things are like drinking and I don't know, having a good time every March 17th. I feel like it's sort of it's an easy draw for Americans who have a choice between genealogy.
Yeah. You're absolutely right about that. But there is another side to it, I think. Which is that, and it is also the history. The history, if they scratch beyond the surface, I mean, the history is very interesting and full of drama and color, and and it's kind of comprehensible in a way.
It's also, we were never the colonizer. I mean, obviously we've done but it's easy to try to row in behind. You're not necessarily the victim, but you're the underdog, the plucky winner. You never did anything wrong to anybody.
And that's absolutely true for a lot of white people in America. It's the way not to be guilty about slavery, and not to be guilty about all that sort of horrific oppression that America was built on.
Yeah.
We didn't do any of that. We were oppressed. It's something we ourselves need to think about a lot. I was in Australia very recently. Every time you think about Australia and you think about what was done to the Aboriginal people, horrific crimes, and it's ongoing, really. And I'm afraid we're right at the heart of that. I mean, we're very often, it's our ancestors who are out killing Aboriginal people. Now, also a lot of Irish who are objecting to that and trying to stop it, and others. But the Irish expansion around the world is very often at the expense of Indigenous people. And we just need to have a more complex sense of history, that yes, absolutely we were oppressed, and colonized and dispossessed, but we also did that to other people.
I mean, we've come across a lot of stories of, even if not, it seems unreasonable to think that, given, say, we had got our freedom in the 1700s, that we wouldn't have been like the Dutch, the Belgians after 1830. Like, there's other equally sized nations that did a lot of damage all around the world, and it seems like very naive to think that, given half a chance, we wouldn't have done the same. And yeah, we've come across a lot of stories about Irish people who fought for the British and helped colonize, whether it be in like the original colonies in America, fighting against the Mexicans, or in Africa. I suppose we've done we did a lot of stuff on behalf of other people, but I was in Australia a few years ago, and I feel like they have a fair. They, I think, seem to try a bit more of Canada, America, and Australia. They've been, and I think they seem to try to uh, acknowledge the Aboriginal um, taking of the land, I suppose, more than the other two. But I guess it's a bit more recent by a number of decades.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think the interest in history in Ireland, you know, is a very progressive and positive thing. You know, we're often accused of being obsessed with the past, and I don't think that's really true. I think one of the really interesting things about Ireland is that it's one of the least nostalgic societies in the world. There was a big survey done, a global one, a couple of years ago, you know, which I was just kind of looking at again, and two years ago, I think. And it was 25 countries, you know, India, China, African countries, European countries, and Ireland was included in it anyway. But they asked this question, you know, about do you agree with this proposition, you know, that I wish things were the way they used to be, you know, that sort of nostalgia, you know. And actually, the country, unsurprisingly, that where people were least likely to say that was China. You know, you can kind of understand, right?
Yeah.
It was not a great place in the 20th century. The next one is Ireland. And I think it's because of stuff we've been talking about. I mean, do people think about the Kerry babies and say, God, I wish we were back in the 1980s, you know? No, we don't, you know. So actually our sense of history is quite sophisticated, you know, and I think there's this kind of cliche about the Irish being sentimental about the past. I think we're deeply unsentimental certainly about the recent past, you know, because people know what it was like, precisely for all the reasons we've been talking about. Like, stuff keeps coming back, you know. It's not like this rosy glow, the past is all back there, you know. It does come back to us, and it doesn't come back in particularly pleasant forms. It's the Kerry babies and the industrial schools and the Magdalen laundries and the mother and baby homes, and, you know, all this kind of stuff, the sexual abuse in schools, and, you know, it keeps going on and on. But I think it maybe does open up for us, you know, some sense that actually, you know, it's not about being nostalgic about the past. It's about actually just trying to understand history and understand the complexity of it and understand how we've got to be the way we are, for good and ill.
Yeah.
You know, which is, I think, like what you guys do is so valuable.
I think we're decent as a country of kind of having open discussions when stuff like, I guess, the tune Mother and Baby Homes. I know, like, all these things take time to process through, but I think we're decent at having open discussions about it. And you were mentioning conspiracy theories earlier on, and pizzas and pedophiles. I think it is one of the easiest ways for conspiracies to take hold is to hold up a notion of a better time. You know, there's the post-World War II America, the British Empire. But, yeah, like, when was our better time? Was it the 80s when all these atrocities are happening and, you know, Ireland's very conservative and you can't leave? Was it the 1930s when there's witch hunts for communism? Was it under British Empire? Like, there's no time to harken back to, like, the good old days, and let's get Ireland back to that, which is hopefully going to stand to us, I guess. Or maybe we could try and go back to 1997, Aircom, 1991, Ireland in the USA playing football.
I guess they're like in the 90s. You talk about it later on in the book about, I don't think I have the quote in front of me, but like the history of Ireland is basically adapting with everything that's coming over. And it's, we would have looked back at I think you call it the holy trinity of the medical devices, big pharma and IT coming in the 90s, and how was the Heaney quote, you're neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass. That Ireland, because even the Ireland I grew up in would have been somewhat Americanized, and now now it's almost unrecognizable, but in positive senses as well. Not just losing our culture, but we've gotten the culture of, say, even to the referendums in the 80s. That was a 2-1. The referendums that we had a couple of years ago were 2-1 in the opposite direction.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, I think, you know, because why are, you know, this kind of populist conservative movement around the world it's all sort of, it uses the idea or weaponizes the idea that culture is something we got from the past. You know, it's an identity that was given to us by our forefathers, and then the only thing that can happen to it is really you can lose it. You know, it's threatened by all these other forces. And actually, I mean, one of the reasons I think the Irish story is actually very interesting to people elsewhere is that, you know, actually it's sort of proves the opposite, because I mean, Ireland is still very Irish. It's still a very vibrant culture, and it's a vibrant culture because what it's done throughout its long history, is to respond to change. Some of it really horrible change. I'm not saying change is, look, it was always a nice thing. The Vikings arriving and raping you and taking your gold is probably not a very pleasant thing. But over time, you can see the culture adapts to that, right? It takes in and it changes with parts of what they say the Vikings are bringing, right? Like cities, with no cities, with no money, all these kind of things. And repeatedly, that's what we do, and I think the same thing has happened with the Americanization. It's not that it's obliterated, Irish culture, Irish identity. The way we've dealt with it ourselves actually has kind of allowed us to have the possibility actually of maybe making sense of our own independence. We have the resources in Ireland now to be able to create a decent society. We haven't done it yet, but that's our fault now,
Yeah.
But one of the things I think we've maybe hopefully got over historically is it was always somebody else's fault, and in a way that is kind of built into colonialism, isn't it? If you've got masters, well, actually, it's not unreasonable to blame them for everything because they've decided that they're in charge. But we're 100 years out of it now. We've an independent state. And hopefully, we're getting towards the point of saying the reason we've got a shocking housing crisis in the country, it's nothing to do with the Brits, it's nothing to do with the Americans, it's nothing to do with anybody else,
Yeah.
It's Irish government's mismanagement of the resources that exist in Ireland, which are thankfully a lot more plentiful than they've ever been before.
Yeah.
We'll find a way to blame it on someone.
I mean, I can't speak Irish, and I think that that's definitely the British's fault, even though,
yeah.
It was 100 and some odd years ago now. I'm not 100% sure if this is accurate, but I think I'm right in saying that Hebrew was a dead language until the modern nation of Israel, which is cautious about looking to Israel for advice and stuff, but they did bring back the dead language, which, I mean, there's no excuse for the fact that we can't speak Irish as a nation now. And I think you're right in saying that we do. It is sort of the default is just to blame someone else, because even as a political move, it'll certainly buy you a bit of time.
My theory on the Irish language is that actually they should have banned it.
Oh yeah,
then we'd all be speaking it
to make it sexier.
Yeah, well, if you look at Catalan, for example, which was banned for decades under General Franco, you could not speak Catalan, you couldn't give your kids Catalan names, you couldn't write in the language, you couldn't publish anything in the language. Thriving, everybody in Catalonia speaks Catalan,
Yeah.
I think we might need a better football team first.
Yeah, well,
I have a long-standing bet I used to live with a Catalonian guy about 10 years ago, and we had a bet that if Catalonian got its freedom before a united Ireland, I need to get a Catalonian flag tattooed on me, and he used to get the Irish flag if it's vice versa. So, it's good to have skin in the game. So where it's really got me rooting for a united Ireland.
Both of you may have quite old skin, though, by the time either of those things actually happen.
That is true, yeah. I suppose one of the questions I had was, how do you think, is there any improvements that could be made in teaching history to the youth these days in order to, because it is, for my money, one of the most fascinating subjects that we can teach, and it's basically the story, it's just stories, but I'm not sure what the uptake is in it now, and there is a kind of sense that around the country Irish history is 1916 and then a couple of things that famous emigrants did, and that's it.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you, that it's vital. It's vital to citizenship. It's vital to belonging. It's vital to kind of understanding where you are. I mean, but it's the mirror that you can look into, and there was a move, as you know, to sort of make it a non-compulsory subject. I mean, it's basically kind of marginalize it within the second level curriculum, which I think was a disgrace. And that's been reversed now, I think. And maybe there's some understanding that that you're playing with fire. Actually, if you disable people's historical consciousness, you're taking away their critical faculties, their ability to actually think about. Because what history does for us is it says, look, stuff has happened before.
Yeah.
We're not unique. It's not like we're the first people ever to have to face these problems, and we can learn both what not to do, and maybe sometimes what might work or might make sense. And I think we have to inject that element back into it, of in the way of teaching it, that sort of urgency, that it's not just a kind of dry academic discipline. I mean, it is a discipline. It has to be done rigorously, of course, absolutely. It's not. That's not what it's fundamentally for. It's fundamentally for understanding ourselves. And I mean, I don't know, if you talk to teachers, one of the ironies is always that kids whose parents have emigrated here from abroad are always very enthusiastic about studying Irish history. They get the thing, that I have to know where I am. I have to know what I'm going to be part of. If I'm going to be Irish, what does that mean? And you can't address that without understanding the history. But history in the broadest sense, as you say, I mean, not just like, a couple of failed revolutions and the martyrs, I mean, the really broad history of how people have lived on this island, which is a hugely interesting story. I mean, it's fascinating.
I mean, it's kept us going for at least 4 years now with stories, no sign of stopping. But should we finish up on?
Well, just touching on the history being taught in schools, because we both stopped history after leaving cert. We didn't pursue it in college, and there is somewhat of a lack of teaching our own history to us. That you go to Germany, they obviously study the things they have to study a lot there. Irish people complain that English people don't know enough about their history, but what we mean is they don't know enough about our history. But then also, to an extent, we don't know a lot about that. Even just touching on, so when you're the Good Friday Agreement of '98, it's kind of the juxtaposition of what you were talking about with the referendums in the '80s of just doubling down just to make sure that it's known. The fact that of the kind of rewriting of no one mentioned Sunningdale in 73, 98 has to be the year it all happened, just so that we can all write in behind that. But that would be something that a lot of people wouldn't talk about, or the next generation wouldn't know, and it is kind of like it's a disservice to our own history.
It is, because we really need to know how we got here in order to think about where else do we want to go, and we do need to remember, that. What known about history does for you is it's all about possibilities, right? If something happened in the past, it means it can happen. That's the awful stuff. There's the Holocaust, the troubles, the dreadful stuff, but also the resilience of people, the capacity of people to survive. Like what ordinary Irish people have done over the centuries to navigate their way around poverty and oppression and ignorance and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it's actually a very heartening story, and we should tell it to ourselves.
Absolutely. Well, sure, we're about to get cut off here for the Zoom call, but listen, it was a pleasure to talk to you, Fintan. Thanks for taking the time, and everyone should go and pick up a copy of We Don't Know Ourselves.
Pleasure to talk to you.
All right. Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers, Fintan.
Bye.